Doobie-doobie-doo, boop, boop. Boop-a-doobie-doo, boop, boop.
Tyler.
Oh. Hello. Welcome to X-Men Queering Arthur, a podcast where you can join us in exploring queer interpretations of Arthurian legend. I'm Dr. Shyler Rad.
And I'm Kelly Oakler.
Today we're talking about the life of Saint Goeznovius from 1019 CE. This episode contains references to the power of religious institutions, ostracism from social communities, religious intolerance, propaganda, segregation, misogynistic and homophobic violence and torture, sexual assault, and slavery.
If any of that sounds like it would be too hard for you to listen to right now, then take care of yourself and skip this one.
This episode is part one of a 5-part series on the Arthurian Hagiographies of the early Middle Ages. While the writings on the lives of these saints were made at the tail end of the early Middle Ages, the saints about whom the hagiographies are written all lived in the 5th and 6th centuries. Since we've already covered this span of time from the 5th to 10th centuries, we've prepared a parallel series of members-only episodes where we thrust our gaze more intensely upon the cultural context of these saints, specifically the spiritual and religious context.
In this exclusive episode, the inaugural installment of our members-only series, accessible via Patreon, we invite the esteemed knights of our virtual round table to join us in a unique auditory adventure. Through the power of our collective imagination, we'll embark on a spacewalk to the religion satellite, a key component of our network of hermeneutic satellites. This radio play promises to be an immersive journey, blending narrative and imagination exclusively for our cherished members.
So, if you're interested in that topic at the intersection of Arthurian legends, queer theory, and religion in medieval Britain, then join our virtual roundtable as a knight.
But for everyone, here's a sneak peek. So, unlike in other episodes where we've hovered around the high-level view, according to this metaphor, hopping from satellite to satellite, we're going to spend some time with this religion satellite. Just one high-level view of the cultural context in terms of religion and extending the metaphor.
So, let us begin. Starting with a high-level cultural view of religion. Imagine yourself out there, in space, safe, motivated.
We hope you enjoyed that sneak peek of our first members-only episodes, available to the esteemed knights of our virtual roundtable. Become a patron and get access.
Now, let's take what we've learned about the cultural context of the 5th and 10th centuries from previous episodes and zoom in on the author of our text for today. Not much is known about them for sure. The author names themselves as William, a Breton. We haven't talked about Brittany on the podcast so far, but Brittany is a region in modern-day France, in the northeast of the country. It's very close to modern-day England and Wales. In fact, by ship, it's easier to get from Wales to Brittany than it is to get from, say, Wales to London over land. Brittany is a region with a Celtic culture, closely related to Arthurian legend. William the Breton was related to a Bishop Eudo of Lyon. Hagiologist André-Yves Bourget from Université de Bretagne Occidentale pinpoints William the Breton, a chronicler and poet, as the author. Although this would put the authorship about 150 years later than what White tells us in the Arthurian anthology we're reading from. Now, if William the Breton, or Guillaume le Breton, is the William self-identified in this hagiography, then it would be a significant addition to his already large corpus of work, which can be found in the anthology by Henri Delaborde from 1885. When doing this research, one queer resonance that came to me, if Guillaume is indeed the author, would be that he was entrusted with the education of Pierre Charlot, the illegitimate son of King Philip Augustus.
So this is queer because the concept of legitimacy has had declining influence since the sexual revolution of the 20th century. But in the time this hagiography was written, the common conception was that the child was illegitimate because the child was born outside of marriage.
But as we can see from the dispensation given to Pierre by the Pope, the concept of illegitimacy was legitimized only by the power of the church, and people's belief in the concept of illegitimacy only strengthened the church.
This happens a lot when an authority reinforces its power through the social norms and beliefs it establishes. In addition to illegitimacy of children, the church defined what was morally acceptable, like condemning certain behaviors as sins. The church reinforced its position as the moral and spiritual authority. The church's power to deny sacraments and religious services due to excommunication of individuals or regional interdictions relied on the widespread belief in the importance of these religious rites, reinforcing the church's authority by demonstrating the severe consequences of opposing it.
Something similar can be said of the caste system in India, which established a social order purportedly based on religious doctrine, and thereby became self-reinforcing, with each caste internalizing and perpetuating its role, thus maintaining the status quo and the power of the upper castes.
I'm sure it's happened in every culture. Confucianism in imperial China, Nazi propaganda in Germany, and racial segregation in the United States come to mind as well.
Yeah, power reinforcing itself is the rule across cultures and time, not the exception.
And we've talked about this internalized homophobia before, haven't we?
I'm not sure.
Well, it seems to be another example.
How so?
Queer folks who grew up in a society where churches, governments, and so on make their homophobic ideas so ingrained in the culture that even LGBTQ plus individuals start believing them.
Now let's zoom in on the text. In addition to some debate over the authorship, there seems to be debate as to the source of the text. If it was written by Guillaume, who lived from 1165 to 1225, that would mean he had access to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Histoire Regnum Britanniae, or the HRB, written around 1136, and would put this text in the tradition of the early French chivalric romances, like those of Chrétien de Troyes. However, it seems this debate cannot be entirely settled, as our hagiography includes material that is not found in the HRB, and suggests that the author had access to an earlier document that no longer exists.
The hagiography doesn't have those legendary and fantastical aspects we've seen so much of.
Yeah, good point.
So the readers who had been exposed to the philosophy of academic skepticism shared by Cicero, which was not uncommon amongst medieval scholars, then the lack of legend and fantasy might have encouraged them to believe that King Arthur was a real figure.
So cutting out these legendary aspects, the mythological aspects, that's this process of demythologization. I was thinking of Thomas Jefferson's Bible, the Jefferson Bible. I was watching this documentary and it recreated Jefferson sitting there at his table with a Bible with a razor, like cutting the pages apart, taking out paragraphs and throwing them away, and then taking other paragraphs and gluing them down on another piece of paper. So what Jefferson was doing was taking out the legendary and fantastical aspects to preserve the moralistic lessons. That process of demythologization can be really useful. It's a sort of interpretation of a text. It's a hermeneutic. Like, we use a queer hermeneutic in this podcast, which is a type of reinterpretation, but it's kind of the opposite of demythologization, where in the life of St. Goeznovius, which we're talking about today, it's demythologized, similar to like Thomas Jefferson's Bible. It's demythologized, but a queer hermeneutic kind of does a retelling, like kind of like Hamilton.
Did you get there because of Thomas Jefferson?
Work.
But yeah, that's thinking about it a different way, or giving someone another way to observe a text or experience a text, right? Or a story.
A whole new world.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like a lot of people learned some history because of Hamilton, right? Like, it became more accessible. And I think maybe making this story more accessible by removing the, like we said, legend or fantastical elements of it and being like, no, he was real, though. He was real just like you. Then maybe that was very compelling for a lot of people.
Yeah, really, all joking aside, a whole new world, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities, like learning about Alexander Hamilton in a way that was never possible before this reinterpretation of the texts. I think, in fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda was reading the Ron Chernow biography, and that's how he came to the musical, reinterpreting the original text in a new way. And that's kind of what we're doing with the queer hermeneutic. But the point is here with the life of St. Goeznovius is it's also a hermeneutic. It's also a reinterpretation, but it's not...
We're not removing anything from the text or changing it. We're just observing it differently.
Right, exactly. Whereas the authors who worked on this hagiography, they were removing things. Now, let's get to the queer stuff, by not just zooming in on the text, but looking at the text with a queer lens. On page 12, it says, "with the kingdom prospering." This brought to mind for me a concept from queer theory called thrival. While survival is just living and going through the normal biological functions, thrival is a more vigorous form of growth and development. Queer theorist Adam Gretman explains that thrival can be queered, and queer thrival is taking a stance, an ever-changing stance, against social norms. Queer thrival is interesting today because, as we said in a past episode, queer identity was punishable by death in Western countries. And now, being gay is still punishable by death in many places, which is disgusting, and we should all be active in civil disobedience against those countries, like boycotting the products to the best of our ability. But it is a fact that being queer is less dangerous in many places around the world than it was 500, 50, or even 15 years ago.
Considering how queer thrival means flourishing while standing against oppressive and violent social norms, despite these challenges, as the world grows more tolerant, how do queer individuals continue to challenge societal norms and thrive in this evolving landscape?
I think that's like a PhD dissertation. It sounds like a good discussion for our Discord.
Jeeper, Dr. Rat. Isn't that only $1?
By golly, you're right. Just $1. Yeah, we can talk more about this online. I hope our listeners will join us, because it's fascinating to me, and I hope if you're sitting here listening to it, you think it's a fascinating idea too. But zooming out, just because prospering triggered basorexia for me, in the text, it's really more about accumulation of capital and increasing quality of life in an economic sense, not in the sense of sexual liberation or dismantling social norms. However, prospering is a shared experience. It's intersectional. Therefore, this utterance scores a 0 on the queer authenticity scale, neither authentically nor inauthentically queer. The next queer utterance on page 13 was, "the women's tongues were cut out, lest they corrupt the language of the Britons, and were employed as wives and for other service."
So this is a horrifying example of misogynistic violence. This utterance is the patriarchy in its most essential state of evil.
Exactly. Evil is a word that comes to mind. It also brought to mind, for me, the numerous torture devices used in medieval times, like the Pair of Anguish. And there's a scene from HBO's The Tudors where a gay man is punished with a hot poker up the bum. It's horrifying. And this selection from the White Anthology is just as horrifying, if not more so.
Like, the word violence and torture aren't enough. I'm thinking words like evil, degenerate, monster.
It makes me feel so angry and sad thinking about a world like this. So angry. When I was writing this, I was thinking about reaching through time to these evil men and, like, smearing shit on their faces and strangling them and stabbing them and ceremonially eating their internal organs.
Well, now, ceremonial cannibalism is often associated with witches.
Yeah, and now I'm thinking there's a very good reason that a woman in medieval times, driven by the absurdity of these evils of patriarchy, could truly have found themselves exacting this sort of revenge on their oppressors.
Or, on the other hand, I'm thinking of it as a man in medieval times being haunted by nightmares of his violent ways, just like you did here. That evil patriarch might imagine what he would do to someone who treated him like he treated women.
Oh, and so then he projected that sort of revenge on his victims, accusing them of witchcraft.
Yeah, there's some sort of reason for this concept of ritual cannibalism in European witchcraft lore.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we're onto something. But all that said, zooming out, I'm afraid some people are really going to hate the analysis here.
Yeah, I saw it scores a -1 on the queer authenticity scale. Slightly inauthentically queer. Shouldn't it be extremely inauthentically queer?
Well, after much deliberation, I concluded that this utterance, this disgusting example of misogynistic violence, a manifestation of the evilest essence of patriarchy, also reminds me of silencing in general. Enforcing silence, like gagging, is not uncommon. When mutual and consensual, silencing your partner can be a part of a loving relationship.
Well, now, since you're saying that BDSM is on the spectrum of misogynistic violence, this is starting to give some credence to sex-negative feminists like Andrea Dorquin and Sheila Jeffries. They thought all penetrative sex is violent.
Well, the difference between BDSM and misogynistic violence is defined principally by consent, and informed, enthusiastic, and ongoing consent. Also, the intent to explore desires in a controlled environment, leading to mutual satisfaction.
Whereas misogynistic violence is non-consensual, abusive, and stems from sexist beliefs.
BDSM also emphasizes safety and respect to ensure physical and mental health for a strong relationship.
Right, but misogynistic violence is harmful and disrespectful.
The next basorexia triggering utterance was also on page 13, when it says, Vortigern subdued unjustly most of Britain. This utterance triggered a queer urge in me because it juxtaposed subdual and unjust actions, as if subduing someone could possibly be just. I imagined two axes, orthogonal, making 4 quadrants.
Like a graph?
Yeah, exactly. The horizontal axis goes from subdual to subdued, and the vertical axis goes from just to unjust.
So these 4 quadrants are unjust subdual, and just subdual, unjustly subdued, and justly subdued. Unjust subdual would be colonization. Just subdual would be annexation. Unjustly subdued would be invasion, and justly subdued would be appeasement.
But this could be queered.
Oh?
So, in relationships, unjust subdual would be sexual assault. Just subdual would be consensual domination. unjustly subdued is being a victim of sexual assault, and justly subdued is consenting to submission.
So zooming out, here we are again, comparing BDSM to sexual violence. I'm afraid people are going to hate that.
Well, in this selection, I think consent is treated a little bit differently. Whereas in the last example, there was no justice in women having their tongue cut out. There was just this vague connection to a silencing kink. But in this example, the justice of the action is a legitimate question. Is subduing just? Justice, in this example, here metaphorically being consent.
So Vortigern unjustly subdued Britain, but he could just as well have appeased and annexed, or better yet, formed alliances with other regions of Britain, which would have been consensual.
And that is why this interpretation of this queer utterance scores a 2 on the queer authenticity scale, being authentically queer. Finally, on page 13, it says, driven from Great Britain and forced into servitude.
This selection is the first time slavery appears in the White Anthology. Are we keeping with the emergent theme of this episode and comparing BDSM to sexual violence?
No.
Okay, how is this utterance queer?
Well, misogynistic violence in the earlier example was interpreted as a warped, evil form of domination.
Uh-huh.
And in the previous example, colonization was interpreted as a non-consensual domination.
I remember. We just recorded it. Why are we reviewing what we just talked about?
Yeah, sorry. Being both domination, but evil and non-consensual, shouldn't slavery also be on that same spectrum?
Oh, so we're not comparing BDSM to sexual violence, we're comparing BDSM to slavery.
Yeah, but, well, the question is the slavery mentioned here more like misogynistic violence, in that it is disgusting and therefore inauthentic? Or is it a legitimate question of justice and therefore authentic?
Oh, I see. Well, it is true that domination and submission includes slave and master kinks, but in the text, the slavery is not based on a loving relationship. It's based on ethnicity.
Oh, yeah, right. Slavery in Britain was strongly associated with ethnicity, the Saxons being the colonizer and the Welsh being the slaves.
Okay, so zooming out on this one, it's almost impossible for me to imagine how dominating someone because of their ethnicity could be a legitimate kink, even if consensual.
Yeah, I'd be concerned about the submissive partner's mental health if their ethnicity was a factor in their BDSM relationship. But maybe that just speaks more to my ignorance. I don't know.
No, I agree. That's right. Although real-life slavery is a warped form of domination, like misogynistic violence, slavery based on ethnicity or war crimes is not a legitimate form of domination. So this utterance scores a -2 on the queer authenticity scale, making it inauthentically queer. You can follow us on social media. You can find all of our links at queeringarthur.com. And if you want to contact us directly, you can email us at queeringarthurpodcast@gmail.com.
And, of course, Patreon. Go over to Patreon and help support us and get exclusive benefits. And by doing so, not only will you get free stickers and access to the Queering Arthur Discord and access to members-only episodes, we'll soon be announcing a special project where you can take an active and authentic role in our virtual roundtable's quest of queering Arthur. I look forward to working with you.
We'd like to thank our friends and family, especially Andrew Chard, our patrons, and listeners. We acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on the lands of the Nisqually tribe and the Squaxin Island tribe.
Now that you know a bit about using BDSM concepts in queer hermeneutics, let me leave you with this. How is consent, whether personal, political, or both, a type of justice in terms of balance and fairness? How is it a type of freedom in terms of autonomy and personal expression? And how do these two aspects of consent coexist or conflict? Stay chivalrous, queerthers.